Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Well, while lots of us have been focused on what's going on in Ottawa, Ontario actually released a really interesting report that could have wide-ranging long-term implications on housing in the GTA and in Ontario. It was called the Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force Report. And I wanted to check in with Lior Margulies, who I've interviewed before. He's from Robbins Appleby. He heads up the real estate legal group at Robbins Appleby. And he wanted to bring on the show as well a partner of his, John Fox, who is a partner at the law firm of Robbins Appleby as well. He specializes in development and housing law. Interestingly, at one point before returning to law, he ran the development division at Toronto Community Housing, and about half of his practice currently relates to social and affordable housing. Gentlemen, how are you? Welcome to the show.
We're great. We're pleased to be here.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
My pleasure. So maybe I could start with you, John. Tell me, what is this Housing Affordability Task Force report all about?
It's really all about delivering more supply of housing in Ontario. So the Premier and Minister Clark gathered a round table of leaders in both the private and nonprofit sector and had them come up with a list of actions that could be taken, kind of a menu for the government to choose from, which they believe will affect market price of housing. It's really a market price piece, and it drives at creating sufficient supply to impact price. And of course, we don't have a crystal ball, so whether that works or not, we would have to see, depending on how the market reacts to this kind of change, should it be enacted.
These recommendations supposedly produce 1.5 million new houses in 10 years. Is that anywhere near possible?
Well, everything is possible, and the recommendations themselves don't produce anything. You'd have to turn the whole thing over to the building industry to actually create that kind of housing. I think the secondary question to that one is, even if you create 1.5 million new houses, is that, even given the level of demand, are you outpacing demand sufficiently to impact price, which is the intent of the recommendation? So that will not be seen unless we actually do it. And there's a lot to talk about and how that's delivered through those recommendations. So it is a tall order. And one of the things that is good about this report is it also talks about other constraints other than zoning. It also talks about the importance of investing in the labor market, which supports our construction industry, and which is very important in order to deliver this kind of thing. So I'm glad that they looked at it, took a holistic approach to that particular delivery chain.
Now, Lior, one of the things that you and I have spoken about in the past is development delays. And one of the things that's in this report is a way of reducing development delays. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, a lot of the report deals with that in so many fashions. And it's if we got, like I said, if we can get 25% of some of these recommendations implemented by the province, there'd be huge changes. I mean, some of the development delays, relate to zoning, for instance. Zoning is what takes so long to get properties from upgraded to permit higher density. And now the zoning process is bogged down vis-a-vis the number of public consultations, for instance. And the cities, particularly some that are like the City of Toronto, has extended the number of public consultations beyond what's contemplated in the Planning Act. Of course, there has to be. So they're trying to limit those back to what they are. They're trying to create as of zoning rights, so that certain types of developments in certain areas, you don't have to get it rezoned if they're smaller developments, if there are developments around transit nodes, basically to move that part forward. There's extensive type of changes that are in there. Part of it is to limit the whole NIMBYism issue that slows down the process, and also involves the political process. Much of the planning process is supposedly with planners who are trained and look at and deal with the technical and the real issues. It gets mixed up with councillors coming into the planning department saying, let's do this, let's delay that. And a lot of these changes are supposed to put the planning process back into the hands of those that know what they're talking about and take out the political process. There's many things. The Heritage Act, for instance, is a huge issue. because what the cities have been using the Heritage Act is to freeze development, essentially. Like the city of Toronto took blocks of land in the core, I think it was up on Yonge Street, and said this whole block is going to be on the Heritage Register, and that's just, you know, puts a roadblock on the development application. They won't be able to do that. They get an application on a building that the city suddenly says is now heritage, and this is after the application is in. So they retroactively designate it or start the process, again, freezing it. And, you know, things like that are unfair, and the recommendations are to eliminate those things.
Do you think there's a chance that this all get implemented?
Well, two things have to happen. Number one, the Conservative government has to get reelected, because we only have a month from now until I think the provincial legislature stops about the end of March and before they go on to their election campaign, which is into June. So number one, the Conservatives have to be reelected. Number two, there's going to be a lot of backlash or opposition to a lot of these changes that from the municipalities, because essentially the province is trying to take away, and you will hear this very soon, from the cities, their ability to control their own destiny. Things like having standard subdivision conditions, so that you don't have every municipality has their own separate conditions. The restricting site plan requirements. So many restrictions on the city or municipalities that are in here. It'll be a political battle. Technically, the province can do what it likes, but the reality is, you know, they have to deal with their voters. But I think you'll see a lot of these come through. I think if we re-elect the Ford government, yes.
Yeah, guys, I don't think that all those task force members are card-carrying Conservatives, and I don't think that every recommendation here is going to live or die based on who gets re-elected. But Lior is right to identify at its core a tension between what is being asked for here, which is to put like a lot more authority in the hands of the developer or a house owner, in fact, as opposed to having it running through the political process. So there's an old expression, right? Democracy is the worst system in the world, except for all the others. And at the core of this is how much democracy are you allowed to have here? So one of the recommendations is that a guy like me who owns a house in North Toronto can turn it into a 4-bedroom apartment, and my neighbors can have nothing to say about it. So that's what as of right zoning means. If you think that that is not going to attract some political opposition, you haven't been watching development in Toronto for a while. And that particular kind of opposition is not owned by any particular party. There are, I mean, when I was at TCHC, one of the most ferocious opponents to density, where the density was benefiting the public purse, was the Premier's brother. And he was completely in line with the neighbors. And so I would expect to see a fair amount of opposition in that regard. And I think that political process will happen within the Conservative caucus as well, because they have to figure this out. This is a recommendation to the minister. And the minister, by the way, I have a tremendous amount of respect for, is now challenged with weighing the recommendations of a task force against his own sort of political approach in the next election. So standing up and saying, we are going to support changes, which means that we could basically convert North Toronto into Notre Dame de Grâce in Montreal and change the character of the neighborhood, has its own political ramifications. And guys like me might have stand up and say, well, that's a good thing because it generates more housing, but there will be people who will say the opposite for sure. And they will not be limited to a particular political stripe, I promise you that.
We're chatting tonight about the Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force report that's recently been released that really could dramatically change the housing sector in the Greater Toronto Area and Ontario. We're chatting with Lior Margulies and John Fox, both lawyers at Robbins Appleby, a law firm in Toronto. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with John and Lior in just a minute. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. It's interesting today to discuss the Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force report with Lior Margulies and John Fox. They're both lawyers with Robbins Appleby, a law firm in Toronto. John, maybe I could turn to you and ask you a question. I did a I did a show with Lior back in the fall on this inclusionary zoning rules that the city of Toronto came out with. And it almost seemed like those rules were all about government putting in more regulation and demanding things from developers. And yet this legislation is almost like giving more developers and, as you said, homeowners more freedom.
Right.
So if affordability or lack of affordability is the issue, affordable homes, which is better, government demanding it through regulation or government allowing it through deregulation?
I think you're actually looking at two very different things. So let me just quibble with one expression you use. So inclusionary zoning is legislation. This is a recommendation. There's no legislation here yet. So the biggest difference between the two is policies, so they're aimed at very different places. So this task force report is aimed at lowering the price of market housing across the board by effectively swamping demand with supply. That's largely what it's at. And we can talk about the conversion of ownership to rental, because that's also at the core of this. Inclusionary zoning deals with people who need housing below that market price. They're not buying at the margins and can't. So part of the nonprofit or housing sector view of this kind of report is that's great, but thanks for thinking that there's a housing crisis. There has been housing crisis for many people for much longer than this report has been around, and inclusionary zoning is aimed at doing that. Inclusionary zoning, in my view, is, as it exists as we know it in Toronto, is a political compromise, a classic Canadian political compromise. It is a regulation created and drafted in its detail by the City of Toronto, but under the authority provided to it by a conservative government and led by a mayor who used to be a leader of the Conservative Party. So it is a true political compromise in that regard. If there's another debate associated, and they talk about this in the appendix of this report, associated with where the money to fund inclusionary zoning ought to come from. My view is that we should be letting this experiment run the way it is, because we have limited, and this is where the compromise comes in, the Conservative government limited inclusionary zoning to transit stations where billions of dollars of public money has already gone in. And so to a certain extent, we're just extracting a little bit of that to provide below market housing through this mechanism. It's also a much smaller contribution to the overall housing stock, inclusionary zoning, by comparison to what is being what the approach is here. So by taking my house and others like this and turning it to 4 over and over again, you create much more housing at the margin where you have a market price, because I'm not doing it for free, than you would through inclusionary zoning. So they're very different, and they're aimed at very different segments of the housing market.
Lior, what do you think? Do we need both inclusionary zoning and this affordability task force report?
For sure. Look, the IZ is intended to help those below the market that can't afford market prices, whether we bring down the price or not. That's, and nobody has any objection to the IZ. It's really how it's funded, and as John said. And if you remember what we talked about, Toronto is the only jurisdiction in North America that is requiring the developer and ultimately the home purchaser to pay for the cost of the affordable housing. So that's a different issue. But I think they can subsist together. The proposals on the task force report will help speed through development, increase supply, and if you increase supply, you will ultimately, based on Economics 101, get the price down. And the task force actually has some things in there for affordable housing. Taking, for instance, getting rid of development charges for affordable housing units, rentals that are going to be there for 40 years, for instance. There's all kinds of things that can help. They can relax the zoning requirements for affordable housing projects. So the two can subsist. And remember, we live in a society where we have the missing middle, and that's what this report is for primarily. The missing middle, those people that are not on the bottom of the economic chain, that need help from the government or from IZ. They're everyday people that aren't rich enough and don't have parents that can give them 25% deposits to create housing that they can afford, either renting it or buying it. So the two can definitely subsist together.
Let's come back to these zoning rules, if we could. I've had, planners like Joe Barrage, Ken Greenberg, and other people on my show who are sort of renowned city planners in the Greater Toronto Area, if not around the world. And they have both described that one of the biggest problems is this NIMBYism that you spoke about, where there's just so much opposition from local neighbors to any kind of development, and therefore the local councillors end up being very influenced by the existing electorate and those NIMBYs and vote against it. And in fact, I had Joe Barrage on my show, and he said the biggest problem is that these councillors are like lords and fiefdoms, where they run what goes on in their local ward, and no other councillor, no planning department, no mayor will override their decisions. And so therefore, what you got to do is you got to influence that local councillor, and if you can't, you're dead in the water. How do we solve that problem?
One is tempted just to say yes, Brian, but to solve that problem on the current ward system would be extremely difficult, because the swing vote. So if you take a ward of 80,000 people, of which maybe 20,000 vote in a municipal election or 25,000 vote in a municipal election, having 1,000 people object to a development is a persuasive argument for a politician. And so even if you want the development, you're better off to say you oppose it and hope it goes through. There are definitely different municipal councillors with more and less sophisticated views of development, and more or less sophisticated ability to use the system as it exists today to extract benefit for their communities, or however it is you want to characterize that. But when I think about developments that have been missed, which could have created housing in the past, it is a real problem. And the extent of that influence is problematic. So sometimes I think what we would need to do is actually switch to a citywide council system, or have larger wards, so the influence of individual groups on individual properties would be lessened. But I'd welcome the debate on that for sure.
Leora, I was speaking to a planning expert the other day, and he said, and I'm going to quote here, "The city has put us in this housing crisis because of policy zealots that don't believe in the need for affordable housing." What do you think?
When you say affordable, when they say affordable housing, they're talking about affordable housing for the missing middle, not
for the market. The lack of density, lack of approvals, lack of supply has put us in this housing crisis because policy zealots that restrict height, restrict density, restrict the missing middle, restrict condos going over X number of floors on major streets that could easily have higher density, end up creating lack of supply.
Well, you're right. There is a philosophy, from what I can tell, in this city, and probably others, but this city in particular, that has a phobia about height. It has a phobia about changing the character of neighborhoods. 70% of Toronto housing is single family or semi-detached. That's a huge, that means that only 30% is higher density. And that has to change if we're going to fit more people in here. You're right. He's right. There is a problem, and with the philosophies in the planning department in terms of what they want to do. I've told you the story of fighting at the OMB to go from 6 stories to 7 stories on Ossington, where we were tearing down a horrible old repair yard and stuff. Everyone should have been like clapping, and yet we had to go to the OMB to get 1 more story. That's what you face in the city. So this report, it essentially, as I said before, starts taking away the discretion of either the politicians, like John said, that get the politics in the way, or the planners even, who get this myopic philosophies of height and density. The report, it talks about, for instance, a building where they were where the city looks at shadowing. They have very specific shadowing rules, so they don't want shadows over parks. And this proposed development, they took away a number of floors because they wanted an extra 6% of light in the off summer years. And what that did, it took away 30 or 40 affordable housing units. How dumb is that? So this is what this report is trying to get away from. This rigid, philosophical views of planners who have no idea what it is in the real world. That's part of the problem.
But sometimes the planners are in favor of developments which are more aggressive than the local politician is able to handle. I think of the cautionary tale of Ann Johnson at sort of Yonge and Eglinton. Of course, those towers should be there. It's right on top of a subway. So when they talk about in the report, talking about making sure that there is a very liberal zoning regime for height around subways, like this should almost be a no-brainer. But poor Ann Johnson supports that, and then she loses the next election because of the tremendous opposition within her community. So good on her for having the backbone to support what was the right development at the time. But you can see the direct political consequences in that case, and it is a cautionary tale which people are aware of in the city of Toronto. But that is still the right thing to do, and so I'm glad the report pushes the conversation in that direction.
John, you worked Toronto Community Housing, is that correct?
I sure did.
So that's civil service, or
Yes.
I guess it's a not-for-profit, but run by the government. And you are now in private practice. This planner told me that that planners that believe in development and believe that private enterprise can build great developments, great homes, go into private practice. And planners that don't believe that believe that government needs to restrict, go into government planning departments. And that's the problem, that you've got people that are positive to development are in private practice, and people that want to restrict private development because they think government knows best go into government. And they have to end up mediating all these development applications. Is that the problem?
No, I don't think that's the problem. I think that within government, you have simply a more conservative approach. I think TCHC is kind of a unique beast. I think that its mandate was to redevelop land, and there was a necessary amount of risk taking, and it had a CEO capable of allowing that to happen at the time, and so it was able to proceed in that kind of way. I think all big organizations, whether they're public or private, have resistance to change, and I think that happens within the city, and it happens within large private organizations too. I think the comparison to a large extent is between more entrepreneurial organizations. Developers are fundamentally entrepreneurial organizations, and when they meet up with a more process-driven organization, but I didn't necessarily put that at the feet of the individuals who make those choices. Like they're in it for all the right reasons, and I would hesitate to be saying that it's a matter of individuals and where they end up going. So that's why I say no.
Lior, I'm not sure if you know about Houston at all, but I ended up having an interesting discussion that said Houston, which I understand has almost no zoning regulation, and the planning department almost allows you to build whatever you want to build, doesn't end up having a housing crisis. Now, some people have argued that it's led to bad developments, but you've got tons of housing. You don't have escalating housing prices, even in a market where tons of people are going to it. So what's the right solution? Less regulation or more regulation?
Well, look, I mean, you have Houston and then you have Dallas, which are, a tale of two cities. And Dallas is more like Toronto, and Houston is the Wild West. Yes, Houston has tremendous housing, but it has tremendous sprawl. It has tremendous traffic problems. So there's a price to pay for sort of freedom. Look, I mean, the reality is you need a balance. You can't have development running sort of rampant. But what we have now is such restrictions from every level, from the provincial and the municipal level. You've got to break the back of that. I think I mentioned maybe in one of my previous attendances here. I've been working with Build for 20 years, so I've seen all the legislation that's gone through. We had 12 years of Liberal government, and I off the top of my head, without doing any examination, came up with 15 pieces of legislation in 10 years aimed directly at restricting and regulating the housing industry. And if I thought of 15, there's probably 20 or 30. And that's what's happened to the housing industry. It's been so overregulated, and there is so much, and the NIMBYism has grown because of the growth of the province. We have to break the back of that. So yes, you need a balance. You can't, I'm not in favor of Houston. I'm probably more in favor of Dallas. It's a nicer city anyways and has less humidity. You got to have a balance. And that's what this tries to do. This report tries to take out the NIMBYism aspect, which is the ward system that we can't get rid of. It's just not going to happen quickly. And it creates some more province-wide standards for creating a balance. You know, not all these items will come through, but I'm sure a lot of them will. You do need that balance. Thank God we have this, what's it called, the Ontario Land Tribunal. There used to be the OMB and LPAT. We have that as a check and balance against the NIMBYism. Nobody else in the world, I think, has it, and it sort of tells you why we need it. And there's changes to that as well too that will help eliminate the NIMBYism and the delays that can happen. So I think a balance is definitely the way to go, and this report does that.
And there's tonight with Leor Margulies and John Fox, lawyers at Robbins Appleby, a law firm in Toronto. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with John and Leor in just a minute. I'm going to ask them a little bit about the makeup of this task force and whether it really was representative of the industry, what we think the minister is going to do. And I'm going to challenge Leor on this last comment that he made in regards to NIMBYism and where we go. Stay with us, everybody. Fascinating conversation tonight. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight about a recent report, the Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force report that was released, and may not have gotten the media attention that it deserved because everyone was focused on truck convoys and protests and occupations and blockages and things like that. But it actually could, I think, address some of the biggest problems that people are objecting to right now, which is affordable housing. Leor, I wonder if you could just address, does this task force represent the industry? Does it represent the province? Does it represent the people? Who was on it? And does it have a chance of actually being enacted?
Okay, well, first, I just wanted to correct your comment that it hasn't, that the report hasn't received media attention. It actually has. And the interesting part is we've gotten support from what I consider the left media, as well as the right. Of course, the Globe has come out in support of it. There was a very good article or opinion about just after the report came out, but there was another report or opinion from the Toronto Star, which is very, very left of center. I'll just leave it at that. And they were also this was the editorial board, came out in support of this report. So I think in some respects, there's a lot of widespread support for this report because it breaks the back of the problem, which is the red tape and the NIMBYism. So that's number one. In terms of the report, the group, it's actually quite a mix of people. It had two real industry representatives, being Dave Wilkes from the head of BUILD, the industry residential industry association. It had Julie De Lorenzo, who's a well-known developer, but it also had two members of the affordable housing community, the CEO of Habitat for Humanity and the CEO of the Ontario Aboriginal Housing Services. Plus, it had the head of the group, the chairman, was a very senior person from Scotiabank. You had another representative from the sort of commercial industry, and Tim Hudak, a former conservative leader, and he's the head of the Real Estate Association, and a planner. So you had a real mix of people, and they did survey a lot of got a lot of different input for the report. So I think it's pretty broad based. Yes, people will say it was written by the development industry. I've been told that a number of times. And in some respects, that's true. It's true because it's the development industry that's in there trying to get properties developed. They know what the challenges are that are facing them to get properties built quickly and more inexpensively. So there was, these are solutions that we've been putting forward, some of them, for many years. So yes, in fact, it had a development input, but it had tremendous input from the non-development side as well too. So does it have a chance to get through? Again, I think there's going to be a lot of opposition, certainly from the municipal side and even from the NIMBYism people. like a lot of people, those 70% of people, and John is one of them, I have to admit, he lives at Yonge and Lawrence, so he's right smack in the 70% area. They're going to say, I don't want, unrestricted or less restricted development. I want to have my day in court or in the council to stop developments that I don't like. And I don't want the province saying these people can build as of right. So I think you'll have a battle between the haves and the have-nots, the Johns who have what they have, and Leor's children who don't have what they have and want to have it. And it's going to be an interesting battle, but I think you will see, like I said, even we can get a smidgen of them. We didn't talk about the Ontario Land Tribunal changes. It may sound technical. That's where you get the appeals of zoning. These are huge, huge impacts. If we can get those through and nothing else, I would say we'll get 25% of those houses.
Tell us about some of these land tribunal changes then.
So the land tribunal is an appeal process where the developer can appeal a city zoning, where a ratepayer or you as an individual can do so. Right now, an individual for $400 can appeal the city zoning that's gone through and tie up the process for months or years. So they're saying and the process for eliminating cases without merit. There is a process, but it never works. I can tell you, I've been representing developers, and it's very rare they throw them out. Now they're going to say, if you have if you think this zoning is wrong, you better have a case of real merit. And if not, the OLT can throw it out much earlier. Plus, it's not $400. They're recommending $10,000, a lot of money for an individual. But at least you have some skin in the game. And right now, you can have a 3-week hearing with 2 objectors, and everybody pays their own costs. Now the adjudicators can say, you know what, this was a waste of time. We think the developer or the city was correct, and it shouldn't have been appealed, and award costs the other way. So that could make a huge difference. And of course, it's totally underfunded. So we have a backlog of projects that are sitting there waiting to go through. If we can hire more adjudicators and push them through and get rid of the waste, the cases without merit, this would make a big difference. Any of these changes would be huge.
So this is where I wanted to challenge you, Leor, if I could. So I interviewed David Crane, former very influential architectural critic and planning critic in Toronto. And he said the problem with the OMB, the Ontario Land Tribunal, LPAT, whatever you want to call it, is that it allows councillors to not have to grow up and act like adults, because they can, even if they think that the development should get approved, they can object to it, force it to go to the OMB or LPAT, because they know they'll be overruled at that level. And so therefore they can cater to the NIMBYs in their own area and still get the development that they think is right for the market. So is having this LPAT or Land Tribunal or OMB actually helpful to the process? Or if we got rid of it, it would actually make councillors have to grow up and act like adults?
Well, that's an interesting question. Yes, it would force them to grow up and act like adults, but it would also take away the safety valve for developments that are stymied by the council. You still have the NIMBYism without it. You need it as a check and balance for developers. So yes, in theory, a councillor would actually have to make a determination for a development. But if it means getting elected or getting a development, which one is it going to pick? You tell me. So we need it. Yes, it's a problem. They use that as a scapegoat, these councillors. But I would still any day keep maintain that. It's saved so many developments in this province because of the attitude and the structure of voting. So no, I wouldn't take it away. But hopefully, if we restrict the areas where people can object and have developments as of right, you'll have less ability for councillors to say no, and you'll have less appeals to the Ontario Land Tribunal. So
it really sounds like that old line that in this situation, government's the problem rather than not the solution, which is kind of interesting. John, you were saying, you were correcting me and saying there's actually a fair amount of parts of this report that are beneficial to social housing or low-income housing. Tell me a little bit about those sections of this report.
Sure. Well, there's some commonalities in what nonprofit developers do. I think you talked about the development and non-development side. Nonprofits are developers. Ian Underwood, who was on this committee from Habitat, is a developer. Justin Marchand, who Leo referred to, the head of the Ontario Association of the Ontario Aboriginal Housing Society, is in development. We work with both of them. They're very passionate, and some of their influence is here. So when I say before that part of the issue that a nonprofits would have as a housing sector in looking at what part of the housing spectrum is being addressed here, the whole under the market isn't being addressed. And you see some of that being reflected here, both in recognition that Indigenous, Black, and marginalized communities face an even harder hurdles to get over to get into the housing market than Lior's son, for instance, as he was talking about before. But there's a series of other things too. Like they talk about eliminating development charges for nonprofit developments that extend affordability for 40 years. So that's a welcome piece. They acknowledge that the supply cannot hit a huge portion of Ontarians, and they will have to look, if they want to own, then they're going to have to look to programs like Options for Homes or Trillium Housing or others who have second mortgage opportunities. And they talk about directing some of that specifically at Black and Indigenous and marginalized communities. So those are all things where you see the influence of the two nonprofit players on the task force. It is not, though, the task force is very clear. They're not trying to get at the below market problem that they leave for the government. And so this is not a binding philosophy housing policy. It is a set of recommendations from this group to lower the market price of housing. So if you look at the federal government, they do have a binding philosophy. Housing is a human right. And Justin Marchand in his bio even says that. And certainly my group at Robbins believes that. And that doesn't reflect out here because they're not actually attacking the whole spectrum. There's a housing supply across a demand spectrum, and that's not really in here or tries to be in here. One of the things that Lior said earlier is very interesting to me, and that's the relationship between my house and North Toronto and what this solution means. So if a lot of the expression of the problem is we cannot afford to buy, a whole group of people cannot afford to buy a home the way their parents might have. And the solution is to rent my second floor. So if I convert my house into 4-bedroom units, leave aside the NIMBYism for a second, let's say it all goes forward. What happens is there's more housing, more choice within my community, but the answer to that housing crisis is not the ownership of my house out and out. In fact, my house becomes more valuable because I can now convert it as of right into 4 income earning units. So the ability for Lior's son or anybody else in his shoes to come and buy my house has actually dropped as a result of this, and price has gone up on my house. But the ability to live here is now less than it would be to carry the mortgage. So there is a give and take. Like you can appreciate that that's not an easy conversation because there's good and bad. And a lot of what's missing from this report is having to get into that. So if I do that, am I rent controlled on the 3 new units that I created, or am I not rent controlled on those 3 new units? The answer is probably not the way this is going, because it's a market-based thing. So those are questions which are left for the minister to grapple with and trying to balance interests, which is a politician's job. So when we talked earlier about the OMB and politicians and this kind of throwaway line people use, well, they have to grow up. It's not really fair if you're saying you have an obligation to represent these people, so grow up and don't listen to what they have to say. It's a strong politician who turns and says, this is right, it's in the best interest of the city. If you expand that base of voters, you're much more likely to have more people say, yeah, that group over there, they have to eat this because this is the right thing to do for the city. We want to have 60 seniors homes in what otherwise would be a park, for instance, which is, I'm not making that up, that's down the street from me. So I think all that stuff is really important. So there is a lot here. This report is not an attempt to address all affordable housing situations, but it does get into some specific pieces, particularly where it's directly related to what they're asking for in order to drive the development industry to create more housing. The same things apply to nonprofit developers.
We're chatting tonight with John Fox and Lior Margulies of Robbins Appleby. They're both lawyers in the real estate area. Lior, it seems like you're focusing on regular development. And John, you do a lot of not-for-profit and social housing. So it sounds like the two of you have got an interesting practice, both of you at Robbins Appleby and Collective. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with some concluding comments on the Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force report in just a minute. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. It's really interesting for me tonight to chat with Lior Margulies, who heads the real estate legal practice at Robbins Appleby, and his partner, John Fox, who specializes in not-for-profit and social housing. They're both lawyers at Robbins Appleby, which is a law firm in downtown Toronto. Gentlemen, in the last leadership debate for the federal election campaign, Jagmeet Singh was asked a question about housing affordability, and he said it's a problem because there's some people that don't have a house that want to have a dramatic increase in supply. And so therefore house prices go down and housing becomes more affordable and more people can therefore get in the market. But then there's a whole bunch of other people that might be a little bit older that have built up huge net worth in their house. And the last thing they want is housing prices to go down. How do you balance that? And how do you balance that in terms of this Housing Affordability Task Force report that, as you say, wants to increase supply dramatically. And if it increases supply dramatically and demand stays the same, then by definition, housing prices should either go down or not go up by as much as they otherwise should. And so therefore, Lior and John, you're both going to be able to sell your homes for less money.
All right. You want me to go first, Brian?
Sure.
Okay, so first of all, in terms of the dichotomy between the haves and the have-nots, yes, if housing prices stabilize, the people like myself and John who have houses will make less. But quite frankly, we've made money because of the market on the backs of people who are trying to get in. This is sort of found wealth. We didn't create it. I didn't earn it. Suddenly my house, because the prices have gone up 40% in 5 years, my house is now worth another $1 million or whatever it is. It's not, but I wish it was. So I have no sympathy for those people that say, oh, well, I'm not going to make as much. They didn't earn it anyways. And we really have to have a society where everybody has opportunity for housing. And that's not only ownership, that's just rentals, because it all flows down, But more importantly, having this, first of all, this report is sort of, I don't want to say pie in the sky. If we could get all of this, would it be 1.5 million homes? Maybe, maybe not. We won't get all of this. The reality is, if we can get some of it and slow the rate of increase, because we're going to have, the report says we're going to have 2.7 million people coming into this province over the next 10 years. Where are you?
2.7 million new people.
That's the projection. I read it. I haven't seen the backup. So where are you going to put them? That's why they need 1.5 million homes. The reality is we're not going to have 1.5 million homes, but if this report comes through in some fashion, if it's enacted and implemented, we'll get more supply. It will, if it does anything to at least ameliorate the increase and create more variety of supply, we've accomplished something. So those people that have their homes, and maybe it won't double in the next 10 years. So maybe it'll only go up by 5 or 6%. There's nothing wrong with that. Your home is not your retirement plan. Maybe it has become that way. It's not right. It's not right for the people that need, the immigrants that are coming in and the children that are trying to get into the market or have a home to play. So I think there's a balance, and I think this report will come through in some fashion. I think it has to. Otherwise, this crisis is going to be like massive.
Lior, I think you answered that question 10 times better than Jagmeet Singh did. So thank you very much for that. John, what's your bottom line on this report?
Well, first of all, Lior's answer is more radical than Jagmeet Singh. He's practically on the verge of eliminating the capital gains tax for housing, because for 50 years, housing has been a primary source of savings and highly encouraged in policy from both sides of our government aisles as the saving mechanism for retirement. So it is actually a radical statement he's just made. I think he was talking largely about overhousing. So if you could fill more people if you just moved, if you had people take those gains earlier, and you didn't have seniors living in their house with 4 empty bedrooms. When I was at Toronto Community Housing, that's always an issue, right? You want to lower the waiting list for 4-bedroom places. You got to move people out who are only 2 people. But having the government intervene to say, I'm going to throw people out of their house before they want to is, tests my limits of government intervention. And I think I'm probably a little more left on the spectrum than my friend Lior here. I'd say that my final line on this, what I like about it, the thing I like the most about it is the sense of urgency that others have joined the nonprofit and housing sector in understanding that there's an urgent need to address housing across the spectrum of demand is really important. When we pay for it no matter what, right? So if we don't house people, then you get homelessness, and we're paying for it when you go to the hospital, and you end up with a large bill that comes to the public tab. Housing is the least expensive way of dealing with this. A strong and robust nonprofit and co-op sector is something we've been arguing for a long time. Having a report like this, which says this is an urgent need to house people, and we have to act now, and it has to be across political stripes, is important. And I do think this government, particularly the minister, should be applauded for being a bit purple in his outlook, because he has taken advice from all sides all the time. He's a regular at the Ontario Nonprofit Housing Association, at the co-op meetings, stuff like that. So good on him for that. And I hope he continues to listen to people from across the board in coming to his policy conclusions.
John Fox, Lior Margulies, lawyers at Robbins Appleby, thank you so much for joining us tonight and talking about the Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force report. Maybe I can end with my own 2 cents on this topic. I really do think that local government has been more of a problem than a solution in this regard. I think that Lior has talked well about all the regulations that were put in place over the course of the last couple of decades. I think that zoning, NIMBYism, density rules, height rules, heritage rules, development fees, all the different things. I have been involved in the development business, in the pharmaceutical business, in the beer business, in the entertainment business, and there's more regulation in the development business than in almost any other business that I've been, other than maybe the pharmaceutical business, where you're having to test products in thousands of people to prove that they're safe. If we had this kind of regulation in products, I don't think that we'd have the kind of consumer segment of our society that we do, consumer product segment. So I think that getting rid of a lot of these regulations and allowing a little bit more free enterprise is the right solution. And I love just the idea of being able to take your house and turn it into 4 different housing units. If nothing else, that as a right topic to create the missing middle would make sense. I think that height along major boulevards, I think zoning density around transit nodes along major arterials. I had Joe Barrage come in and say, the reality is Yonge Street, Bloor Street, and maybe a couple of other streets will end up being high density if we do the right thing. But the rest of Toronto is going to stay the same, because even with what we've got along Yonge Street, other than maybe around Yonge and Eglinton, a block away, you're back down to single family homes. And so we're not talking about changing all of Toronto, but we are talking about changing some of Toronto. And I think that this Ontario Housing and Affordability Task Force report has a ton of very good recommendations in it. And I hope that Lior and John, you get an opportunity to speak about it on numerous occasions to support its adoption and approval. Anyway, that's our show for tonight, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 p.m. on